Welcome, everyone. I am Jorge Rodriguez. I'm the Associate Director for Strategic Programming at the Hispanic Summer Program. I'm also a visiting assistant professor of historical studies at Union Theological Seminary. And I'm here with my friend and colleague, Débora Junker. Débora, would you mind introducing yourself?
Hello, everyone. I'm Débora Junker. I'm Associate Professor of Critical Pedagogies at Garrett-Evangelical Seminary. And it's a pleasure to be here with you all.
So we're here today to talk a little bit about the state of Latinidad and theological education in the nation and higher ed. But I do think that before doing any of that, it's important to ground ourselves in story. And so, Débora, I'm wondering, how did you get to the academy? How did you get to this place where you're now an associate professor? Even though you're transitioning out of this role, you've been overseeing the Latinx Hispanic Center at Garrett for several years. How did you get here? Did you always want to be a professor?
Oh, maybe yes. Since early age, I used to, when I was in, I think, first grade, I would come back home and I would put my siblings on the side and I would teach them. So I think maybe since then, but I never thought about going to theological education. My undergrad is on education, but I had the blessing for life reasons, I had the blessing of being able to go to Argentina. And in that time when my husband was doing his studies, there was an offering at ISEDET, which was at that time like the biggest place on theological education in South America. And I had the privilege of starting my theological education there with names such as Miguel Bonino, Croato, and other Emilio Monti and others there. So when I returned to Brazil, I start thinking and uh, hoping to study and to have a more like prepared better for the role of a theological educator. So I came. So after a while in Brazil and doing my preparation, I came to US and I did my master and PhD in theological education, specifically in religious education. So that is a little bit of my trajectory. It is like, of course, informed by liberation theology, informed by Freirean thoughts. So that is where I try to focus on my teaching and learning endeavors in those areas.
And what was the biggest learning or shock or surprise transitioning from an institution of theological education in Latin America, generally in Brazil specifically, to then coming to the United States?
Well, let me go a little bit back to say that when I came to US to study, I had already a promise of job at the School of Theology in São Paulo. So I came to be prepared and to return there. So my focus all the time when I was here was to go back to Brazil and do my work there. And that meant for me and for my advisors that my focus was always Brazil, not US. So I didn't try to learn how to navigate the institutions here. And my mentors also didn't care about navigating or helping me to navigate that. So I went back to Brazil. I taught some years there. And when I returned, I really felt the lack on my awareness of how to navigate academic institution here in US. So one thing that I take very seriously when I'm mentoring, when I'm advising here in US, is to help students to understand that they should be prepared to work any place and not to focus in one specific place. So when life changes and life circumstances come, you are ready to take in whatever context you are. So be aware of the context, be aware of the policies and also the politics of those environments are very important no matter where you are.
Yeah. No, and I asked because I think that I'm always intrigued by the tropes and assumptions that institutions have of the Latinx community, right? So one of those tropes and assumptions is that we're all migrants or all immigrants. And I do think that historically that is a reality, right? In some ways, right? There is a reality that many of our community immigrate to the United States or migrate from the United States. But it's also true that many of our community are indigenous to what became the United States. It's also true that many in our community were born in the United States, and the statistics right now are overwhelming at the number of Latinos who were actually born in the United States, and we're actually at a point where there's more Latinos born in the United States and immigrating to the United States for a variety of reasons. But I think that nonetheless, a dynamic that we're constantly facing in our community is how we navigate the distinct positionalities and distinct perspectives that Latinx folk have who immigrated to the United States, as opposed to those like me who were born and raised in the United States.
Yes.
But there's also, I think, the second layer, which is even as we understand those dynamics internally in the community, there's still often a perception from theological education or from higher education that we're all immigrants. And I think that undermines
and also,
the work we do. Yeah.
Yes. And also there is, I think, another layer to this is the fact that we are boxed in as one thing. When we have many cultures, like there is a culture of those born here, and depending on which state they belong to, and also the different cultures that is Latin America. We are all we have all our specific traits. We have a specific kind of cultural kind of characteristics that is not always understood in that way. It's just like, oh, all Latinx think like this or act like this, and that is not true.
And to that end, I'm wondering also about this other dynamic that occurs within the community, which is that historically thinking in, the 1960s, we have this robust moment of social movements in the United States that lead to the farm workers movement, the Young Lords, the Black Panthers, etc. But specifically in the Latinx community, movements like the Young Lords, the Brown Berets, Católicos por la Raza, Padres, Madres, etc. And what these social movements mean is that by the 1970s and 1980s, you have then within religious institutions the rise and emergence of what's called more formal Hispanic ministries, right? So the Hispanic Summer Program starting in 1989 is part and parcel of this trajectory, right? That you have robust social movements in the 60s in the United States that are influenced by Latin American liberation theology that's occurring at the same time. Then by the 80s, you have this become institutionalized through, and by the 90s, through institutions like the Hispanic Summer Program, the Hispanic Theological Initiative, all of which are just mirroring what's happening in some denominations, right? So I think of like Malcha in the Methodist Church.
Uh-huh.
But within that imagination, there is an imagination that to be, well, first of all, they weren't using the term Latinx, they were using the term Hispanic, right? Which also
Yeah.
reflects the ways that the community has changed. But within that, there is an assumption that the community is Spanish speaking. And even though it's from Latin America, it's actually from Hispanoamerica.
Yeah.
And so what that has done now is that 30 years later, or 30 years, 40 years, what is time? We're in this moment where we're trying to reckon with what does this community mean, when the reality is that our Portuguese speaking Brazilian kinfolk have always been there, our Haitian kinfolk have always been there. But the reality also is that within the Hispanic speaking world, quote unquote, there's people who speak Zapoteco, Garifuna, right? And so there's all these dynamics that complexify what
Yeah.
this community means. I'm wondering for you, as someone who, you know, born in Brazil, studied in Argentina, went back to Brazil, came to the US, has been doing this work after going back to Brazil and coming back. How
Mhm.
has this dynamic of what Latinidad means and how it has changed? How do you interpret it and how have you experienced it?
Wow, that's a good question. And I, my first thought about this is that the way I see now, there is a willingness to recognize the differences, that we are not the same. Like we have differences, we have characteristics that defines who we are. I think in my first time here in the US, I didn't feel like that. Um, I I didn't feel that I was part of the community, and even I couldn't take advantage of the um, HEI. HEI, yes,
Yeah,
Hispanic Theological, yes, because I was not Hispanic. That was even what I heard. So now it's different, and I think there is a willingness to include, to be more open, to see that we have commonalities, and I think that is I think an evolution of our experience, like in terms of recognize that we, even though we have little difference here and then, it's not what our biggest struggles. Like
Mhm.
we are struggling in the same kind of intensity uh, against or confronting the forces that wants to uh, erase us, or even to dismiss who we are and the contributions that we can make. I think that it's I see this now um, as a positive change. And I it's sad that that was not my experience at the beginning of
Mhm.
my moving here. But I can see that now is different, and I think of course there are some issues that we have to address, but I think it's different when you address from an individual perspective, when you can address from a collective experience and understanding. And I think we are moving in that direction.
And what do you think has caused that shift in your experience? Has it been like the political dynamics of the nation? Has it been internal wrestling?
Hard to say that. I think it's a like many many elements play here. I think because there is a change in the. I think it is not possible anymore to recognize the uh, the demographic. So, and with the demographic changing, or the shift in demographic, like the Hispanic Latinx demographic now, uh, has impact in economy, has impact in the social life and the cultural life. And I think because of that, not only is, I think the shift is not only external in terms of the larger community or society, but also internal. Because when we can see people in leadership roles that represent us, that internally makes some difference in how we perceive ourselves. And I'm thinking very generic here. Like I think in our population, our communities, I think they are perceiving themselves in a more I don't want to use the word positive ways, but like they are seeing themselves represented in other places in society.
Yeah.
And you can, like, one thing that was very evident was like late evidence of this, I would say the pandemic. When the pandemic hit US and all the other places, but especially here in US, you could tell who were the people that moved that economy, who were the people who were at the front line of every aspect of society. And I think that even though this recognition is not a very, how can I say, is not, it's subtle in many ways. I think that unconsciously can help us to see ourselves in a different light.
Mm-hmm.
Even because I think in that sense, the recognition is not an external recognition, but it's internal. Like,
Yeah.
I know what I can contribute. I know how I can make a difference in my community. Is more like internal. It's like
Mm-hmm.
a agency kind of recognition. I
And
don't
I'm
know.
wondering, no, I think that's helpful. I think that your point that the pandemic really made plain the dynamics of the community, who the essential workers were, et cetera, is really well taken. And I'm wondering too, because there's another, and I'll bring this also to theological education because I do think it's connected. There's also a way in which the pandemic, I think, really, what's the word I'm looking for? Underscored perhaps or intensified perhaps generational differences within the community.
Yes.
And I'm wondering what this looks like for you because, for example, I was sharing before a little bit about how institutions like HSP, HTI, IATH, the other sister organization come to be. And there's very much a politic in the period that even though it is pushing against the grain of a white dominant institution, it is still working within the framework that we need to work within the institutions to push the institutions, right? And that
Yeah.
is a generational theory of change that I think is still pervasive in some sectors of the community, right?
Yeah.
Meanwhile, some of our young folk, and I would include millennials, but especially our Gen Z students, who are the ones who are starting to enter our classrooms, they
Mm-hmm.
were the ones that, went to high school during they went to college during the pandemic because they're entering their master's programs. And many of them are saying, they came, I think often that generations are defined by when they came of age, right? I'm a historian, so forgive me for being a parody of myself. But I often think about like what are the things that affect generations when they came of age? And when they came of age, I mean when they're entering adulthood, that 18 to 25 period, when they're realizing, okay, now now I'm entering a different stage of life, right? I think about the quote unquote silent generation, right? Or the boomers. No, I think it's the silent generation that came of age during the depression, right? And so you see all these stories of folks who are now passing away in their 80s and 90s who they still save every little Ziploc bag, right? They still save every single Tupperware because when they came of age, that moment, collective moment, affected them so deeply. And it wasn't just a depression, it was also, being between two world wars, etc. Well, for this generation, they're coming of age in multiple realities, right? They're coming of age on this side of the first Black president. And secondly, the rise of fascism, both within the US and globally,
And
right? They're coming of age on this side of the 2008 financial crisis, right? That I think affected particularly Gen X in a particular way, but also is affecting the kids of Gen X, which is Gen Z in some ways. They're coming of age during a pandemic, right? Which completely shifted not just our understanding of like globalism, but our understanding of like what happens when the state abdicates its responsibility to its people, right? Um, so they're coming of age in a moment where institutions are really taking a turn, and then add to that the crisis in Palestine, which many of our students deeply identify with, in no small part because of the historic linkages between Palestine and Latin America broadly, right? Latin Americans for decades have identified with the Palestinian struggle. Not all Latin Americans, of course, but there's a rich tradition of organizing, especially in liberationist circles, that have
yes,
seen the struggles of Cuba, Puerto Rico, Palestine, and also even Ireland, all in relationship to one another. And so the question I have for our students who are coming of age and starting to enter our seminary classrooms is, what generational differences are we seeing? And what is the role of theological education in providing tools for a student body that once they graduate our classrooms, they're not even going into churches. They're
yes,
finding new ways to respond to a world that's literally on fire because of the climate catastrophe, a world that's at war, a world where they've lived through the state abdicating its responsibility to its people in multiple ways, a world of rising fascism, and yet they're still coming to theological education. And so what is our responsibility to this generation, and how does our work need to shift given the realities of the shifting context?
well, this is a very complex question and good for our reflection all the time. Because, like as you said, students are coming, and I could say my role, as I see as an educator, is to keep their hope alive, because they come with a lot of struggles, like internal struggles, global struggles, and they relate to that. Like they are sensitive, most of them. Like I think those who let themselves to be sensitive, who let themselves not to be taken over by individualism and all the neoliberalism mindset, they are very sensitive to what is going on. And there is a chance for them to become overwhelmed by those realities and to see themselves as people who has no way to contribute to change that reality. So I think in my case, one of my goals is to keep the hope alive in themselves, like as see themselves as agent of transformation. And I always, of course, you know that Freudian is like the foundation for my pedagogy. And one of his ideas is that an educator without hope is someone without destination. I love that quote because I think that is something that we need to always keep kind of, even when we don't see a light, we need to hope for the light to come in some ways. So, and I think also, like I was, this semester, I taught a course on resistance and re-existence, like perspectives from Global South. And one thing that I like was I began the class with this statement, and I finished the class with this statement. I asked students, what are we resisting? Why are we resisting? And how can we resist? I think this could lead us to frame the shift that we are looking for in theological education. Because to know what we are resisting, we have to have a very critical understanding of that reality. We need to go past beyond what the media tells us about the reality and to look inside, to look in depth what is going on in this world and to come up and to recognize where is the discourse of neoliberalism, what is the discourse of fascism, what is the discourse of alienation. So I think for me, the work of Paulo Freire always is a reminder for me that we need critical conscientization. We need to go through that process of conscientization, and we need to understand our reality before we can. There is another quote which says, Freire says, before reading the word, we need to learn how to read the world, meaning the reality. So if I bring that to theological education, before be aware of all the historical criticism, all the theological ways to do our work in theological education, we need to pair that with the reading of reality of our context, which is very complex. We cannot just translate or put one thing to this context without taking time to understand that context, to understand how things are and why they are the way is there, the way they are there. I think that is something that comes to mind when I'm thinking about your question. I don't know if that is something that you relate or if I answer your question in any way.
No. And what was making me think about is that my first love academically was Latin American liberation theology. I had the privilege, I'm a historian, but I had the privilege when I was in high school. I was running around some evangelical spaces for a short amount of time, which was an important formative time in my life, but also not in curiously, I wouldn't be here where I am without that period. But also, I didn't end up in that space long term. But during those years, in my high school years, I had this one mentor who introduced me to liberation theology, both here in the U.S. and in Latin America. And so in high school, I started reading, Gustavo Gutierrez, Leonardo Boff, and Frary, and a few others. But it didn't really hit me until I was in college and I was starting to leave evangelicalism. And I think that the thing years later that I've reflected upon over and over again about how did liberation theology, specifically Latin American liberation theology, affect my perspective on how institutions work and how social change works, is that my perspective is, and I would love to hear your take, is that what Latin American liberation theology offered was, yes, there was a normative claim about the divine, the divine on the side of the poor. But what it really offered was a method to engage social change, right? How do you see the world?
Yeah.
How do you judge it based on the literature and the theory that's available to you? And then what do, right? See, judge, act, which
Yeah.
is reflected also in the hermeneutic circle, which is reflected in Christian-based communities, which is then articulated in distinct ways among Muslim liberation theologians, among
Yeah.
Minjung liberation theologians, et cetera, et cetera. And so for me, the reason that I bring that up is because when I think about why at Union Theological Seminary, but also at the HSP, we have so many students generally, and Latinx students specifically, coming to pursue theological education, whether or not they themselves are part of a religious institution, whether or not they believe in a divine, which I don't think is the right question to begin with, but is a question that is often operative in seminaries and divinity schools. You know, regardless of their own religious affiliation, they still come to seminaries and divinity schools. And I feel like part of the reason is that they are looking for methods by which to engage the constantly shifting context of their reality. And what Latin American liberation theology offers isn't just a radical vision of a divine that's on the side of the oppressed. What it offers is a methodology by which to engage your context, no matter what that context is. So it's unsurprising to me that out of, the original writings of some of these radical priests, you then get indecent theology, you get, queer liberation theology, you get feminist theology. It's unsurprising to me historically, because
Yeah.
if a method is offered, then you can apply the method to different contexts. And so the point that I'm making here connected to theological education is that I'm fascinated about why so many Latino, there was a new study by, I believe, Pew the other day. It was either Pew or another organization, but what the study was articulating was that an overwhelming number of Latinos specifically are not religiously identified. So they aren't religiously identified. It's well over 20%. And to me, as a person who works with Latinos in theological education, but also this trend follows just the new generation in general that's not religiously identified. If theological education is going to be relevant, it needs to ask, what do we have to offer to respond to this moment in history that offers a distinct perspective from what business schools are offering, what law schools are offering, all of which are important. But our students who aren't religiously identified are still seeking a seminary education. So the question to me is, why? Why are they coming? And also, what do we have to offer that's distinct, that is providing language to respond to this moment in a way that other educational contexts are not? And I'm wondering if the methodological perspectives of Latin American liberation theology and the ways it inflects in organizations like the HSP is part of what is bringing students to us, or if there's something else. There obviously are still students who are seeking, traditional ordination, et cetera, et cetera. I don't want to discount that. But the question that I'm more interested in is, and we see this at Union, we see this at HSP. Why do I have atheists pursuing a master's in divinity? That to me is the question that we need to answer, because that, I think, is a larger contingent of the Latinx community that is emerging, whether or not we want to accept that.
It's very interesting what you just said. And I think it makes me wonder why we still don't have liberation theology or any kind of any version of that as the main thing in theological schools. We still we are almost an appendix to theological education in terms of methodologically speaking, in terms of how to embrace that in a more encompassing way, in a more broad way, because we tend to have in our curriculum like electives that address this. We have specific topics that address those kinds of, where we can go deeper in some of the authors, in some of the methodologies, in some of the proposals. I wonder why there is still so much resistance to incorporate that on the macro level of theological education, and where is the resistance comes from? Like, and if we think about theological education or even education in general, in many ways we are kind of binded, is the word maybe, like we are still in many ways reflecting the neoliberalism way of doing things. Like we are concerned about the metrics and not the content.
Mm-hmm.
We are concerned more about results than consistency, coherence. And I think that is something very important for us to kind of reflect more intentionally about how can the things that you mentioned can be part, like a very intrinsic part of the theological education, and why those students are coming. I think what life is giving, like in a broad sense, is not fulfilling that deep inside earning for life purpose, for life change and transformation. And I think if they found in any way, like in some ways, what they are looking for in theological education, we have a kind of a treasure here that we are not yet able to elaborate more and to kind of amplify our resources in that sense. So I think that is something that we need to think about. And in terms of, we have, as we mentioned before, during the pandemic, we saw the need, we saw the participation, and we saw the areas where the contribution came in. So I think we still need to find the spaces, the open spaces, where we can see that liberation theology, that Latinx scholars can contribute in a more effective way to the theological education.
And I think that, I was just thinking your provocation of what is preventing us from incorporating this liberationist perspective more. I mean, my immediate thought was just twofold. One is that incorporating liberationist sensibilities more centrally requires us, especially those of us in leadership, to profoundly wrestle with tensions, right? Mm-hmm. For example, the tension that what does it look like to build a curriculum, but also an HR strategy that incorporates pay scales, etc., that are attentive to more justice-driven ends, while holding in tension that we live in a system that requires endowments to pay the bills, right?
Yeah.
That's a profound tension, right? Dreaming of a socialist, or perhaps not even socialist, just an egalitarian future,
Yes,
while needing to work within a system that inherently is buttressed by stock markets and global capital, right?
yes,
That's a profound tension. And I think that that's a tension I'm thinking now, putting my union hat on. At union, that's something we struggle with profoundly. Our students
yes,
come seeking, the tradition of James Cone, the tradition of Cornell West, and then encounter also an institution that needs to survive, or not necessarily needs to survive, but for it to be able to educate in this way, needs to be invested in certain ways. And that's a tension. That's a
yes,
profound tension that I think requires critical wrestling.
yes, yes. And coherence, I think it's like the the saying that we like preach until you believe, or walk the talk, or
Mhm.
things like that. We incorporate that in our narratives, but I think in sometimes we don't live out that in
Yeah.
our endeavors, like theological education, or even in life in communities as well, like in our communities. And I think we run the risk of those students coming to us and not finding what they are looking for,
Right.
because I think they are more radical than we imagine
Mm-hmm.
they are. And so we run the risk of first not offering what they are seeking, and also uh, not being, how do you say, accountable for what we think we are saying about ourselves.
Yeah.
And I think that is, and that takes us to a crisis, like identity crisis, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which can have a turnout, like a very not good turnout for both students and for leadership in that
Yeah.
sense.
And I know our time is coming to an end, but I think that this is such a key point of the conversation, because for me, this is something that all institutions are wrestling with, right? How do we create an internal consistency and coherence, to use your language, between our professed articulations of values as institutions
Mm.
and the ways those values manifest in every sector of the institution, including curriculum, including, pay scales. I always think pay scales are central to that, including how we do um, education, because it's not just curriculum, it's also how we actually teach, it's also pedagogy.
Yeah.
And then thinking specifically about the Latinx community, I'm thinking about what it looks like if, from a liberationist perspective, part of the impetus methodologically is to have a preferential option for those on the underside. How does incorporating epistemologies, ways of thinking, ways of knowing, ways of teaching from the global South generally, and I would include Latin, this might be controversial, but I would include Latinx communities and those on the underside of empire within the empire as
Mhm.
part of the broader connection of the global South. How does centering those ways of thinking and knowing tangibly change and shift our institutions?
How? That's the big question. Um, I think the I go back to the experience of living, because we could incorporate in our curriculum liberation theology, for instance, and is like, it's a content. I get to know, I get to study, I get to reflect on what it is and what authors articulate and how they articulate that theology. But if that is just a topic in my course, will not change anything, because my approach to that is very extractivist in terms of I will know what it is and that's all. However, if I really engage in that content from a perspective of leaving it out, I think that is when change can come. And that is when I think theological education or our institution need to be aware of the challenges that we'll face if we want to leave that out. Because I don't want, like the way I understand education is not just to inform people about things, right? We want to form people, and the formation comes for an end, which is transformation. So if I just inform people about the methods of how to do theology, how to articulate my theological thinking, and there is no component of how that impacts the way I live and how I treat people, that knowledge is just informative. It's just information. It's not, will not lead me to transformation, anything. And so when I think about that, there is costs on embracing a theological education that is committed to transformation. Because transformation doesn't come if things remain the same.
Yep.
If relationships and hierarchies remain the same. So I don't know if our institutions are willing to really take the next step, take the next, go to the next level of commitments, and also because the commitment means also what I leave out, what I how do you say, divest myself from. The whole ways of being, ways of doing needs to change if we have that in mind. Unless we want to just to camouflage some of the what the real content with something that is innovative on the appearance and not on the essence.
Right.
And I think that is the challenge that we have, and goes both ways for institutional communities and also for congregations, communities.
Yeah, and I was just thinking as you were saying that, so at the Hispanic Summer Program, we have a curriculum where we invite, it's called the HSB Fellows Program. We invite master's level Latinx students to come with us for a year to work in communications or development. But through that year, we also go through a curriculum on nonprofit management. And one of the things that I often talk about in that curriculum is that for me, good leadership that is attentive to epistemologies from the global south constantly needs to ask, why is our institution here and should it be? And I think that that is the scariest thing a leader can ask. Should my institution exist? But I genuinely think that unless our institutions are willing to grapple with that question, we will never embrace transformation. Should our institution exist? does our mission still have relevance to the world? Do we still provide answers and response and engagement and tools to respond to a world that's on fire, right?
Yes.
And before that, is that what we actually want to do, right? Because I do think that there's a
Yeah.
question of like, is that what the institution wants to do, to be transformative? And if
Yes.
the answer is no, right, then that's going to affect how we engage it, right?
Exactly.
Some might disconnect, some might acquiesce, some
Yes.
might assimilate, right?
Yes.
But
Yes.
if an institution says what we want to do is lead to transformation, then the next question for me is, should we exist? Are
Mm.
we the best way to lead toward transformation? Or should we dissolve and give all the money we have to someone else who's doing that work, right? Because that's a missional stance. And the reason I say that question connects to an epistemology from the global south is because capitalism generally and neoliberalism specifically perpetually wants us to strive towards this alleged theory of perpetual growth, right? The
Yes.
stock market will always grow. The housing market will always grow. We will always grow. And as a result, we're inculcated into this fear of death.
Mm.
Death institutionally, right? We're scared of institutions dying, but we're also scared of us dying, which is why in the United States, old age is such a terrifying idea, right? We're inculcated in a culture that perpetually wants to encourage youth through the products it sells, right?
Yes.
And that also wants to disinvest in care for our elderly neighbors. We don't have a culture of elders. We have a culture of perpetual youth, right? And
Yes.
that's deeply embedded in our capitalist system. So my question is, institutionally, what does it look like to embrace an epistemology from the global south? Well, to me, it's to question capital and the ways that capitalism encourages us into perpetual growth, which requires us to ask in our institutions, why do we exist? And if it is for transformation, should we exist? Is this the best way to lead for that transformation? And I think that that's terrifying, right? That's terrifying for institutional leaders. But I also feel that if I am true to the ways that my elders and ancestors have trained me, both
Mm.
here in the US and in the global south, then I need to be honest about the fact that the myths of capital only exist because of the extraction of my people, right? Which
Yes.
means that this is not necessarily an epistemology that includes me, much less wants me to thrive. And so as our time comes to a close, just with that thought, I have one final question, which is, given these realities in this analysis and these stories of radical transformation and migration, I'm wondering, what is the one thing that you want the next generation of Latinx theological leaders to sit with? You mentioned hope earlier. But what else, in addition to hope, do you want them to wrestle with and reckon with as they enter this new leadership opportunity in the world and this leadership need in the world?
Oh, that's um, it's a hard question because, like, to condense everything in one, like, simple question or simple answer. I think, as I mentioned, hope would be one thing, but I think I would love to the next generation to be able to come back to a place where they be connected with each other, with the land, with creation in a broad sense. Because I think we have lost that connection. We and the climate change is telling us in a hard way what we have done. And I think when we lose the connection with others and with creation, with our environment, we lose connection with ourselves. And I think to be able to rescue that sensitivity is what we need to press on. Because the way things are and what we have seen around us, it's leading us to over time to think about ourselves more and more, because things are hard, things are difficult, so we need to preserve ourselves. And maybe this metaphorically is something that institutions are doing. Because we need to survive, we don't think about what is the need of my cohorts, so I need to survive, and I will look for a job, I will look for resources, I will look for what brings me happiness, what brings me some kind of life stuff. And that becomes more important, the relationships. That becomes more important, that look to my neighbor and see what is their needs and not only my needs. And I think if we get in touch with ourselves and we learn how to live with ourselves in this frame, that it's not the mindset which we are used to, and we do this. It's a movement that needs to go inside and outside, because we need to come to relate to ourselves in a different way, not for what I need to for, but what brings me joy, what uh, uh, how can I recuperate my humanity? So that is an internal movement, but also an external movement, because it's not just about me, it's about the people around me and the creation around me, the environment. So I think maybe if we change this, like beginning from one person to other person, maybe this can reflect the in the communities that we belong, like meaning communities of faith, communities of other kinds of communities, and also institutions, like as we are talking, educational institutions. I think maybe, and that will may discover the answer for your questions.
Mm-hmm.
That is, do we need to exist? Why? And for what purpose?
Yeah.
I think that would be my first reaction to your. Of course, we could elaborate more on those lines.
Yeah, and we certainly will in our next talk. But I'm grateful, Professor, for your insights. I'm grateful for the way our conversation developed in no small part, because I think often when people think of, the topic or title of Latinos, Latine in theological education as a conversation about statistics and numbers and and cultures, etc. And one thing I constantly want to invite, and that the HSP we constantly invite, is like, no, this is a conversation about epistemologies. This is a
Yes.
conversation about how our community sees the world and how
Yeah.
that provides a drastically distinct vision for society and for the ways that we've been inculcated into rampant consumerism, as you're inviting us into, and instead offering a perspective of deep interconnection, which is what I hear you offering.
Yeah.
So, Deborah, I'm profoundly grateful for you. I'm profoundly grateful for our time together and our conversation.
Yes.
Thank you.
It was good. Good. Thank you for your insights and also the way you conduct our conversation. I think was amazing, and I really appreciate this conversation and the flow of that conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.